Hi there. We'd like to welcome you today to a co-branded webinar with Aperture Education and Illuma. Today we're going to be talking about universal screeners, and we're going to be talking about apprehension to action and strategies for using universal screeners to improve overall student wellness. We would like to welcome Dr. Lisa McCoo. Dr. Lisa McCoo is the Director of Program Implementation at Aperture Education. She is a nationally certified school psychologist. In addition, Dr. McCoo is an adjunct professor at the School of Professional and Continuing Studies, as well as a member of the leadership team for SEL in the state of Virginia. Later on today, we'll be speaking with a school partner, Cynthia Price, and we're really looking forward to hearing from both Dr. McCoo and Cynthia. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Brandy. I really appreciate this opportunity to just talk about this very important topic. The well-being of our students has always really been at the forefront for educators, educational leaders. However, it has taken on a much greater significance over the last several years. And districts are rightfully prioritizing how they support the overall well-being of students under their care. That doesn't mean, though, that we know where to start, and sometimes that can be the scariest part. So today, we're going to focus on what leaders in the field tell us about best practices, so we can minimize those apprehensions and feel confident in creating plans that will move us all forward for student well-being. So our goals during this webinar are to explore best practices, to learn practical strategies, and then hear from someone doing the work. Throughout our time today, I'll be asking you to put some ideas in the chat so that we can all hear from each other and we can all learn together. So take a moment and find that chat. And just to let you know, we're going to be sending the slide deck to you. So all the links that I mentioned in our slide deck, you will get the slides. You get access to all those resources. So let's go ahead and get started. So looking back over the last couple of years, if you only based your knowledge of the pandemic impact on what you read in the headlines, things are pretty dire. And there's no shortage of information about how the pandemic has negatively impacted student well-being. And without a doubt, things are really hard. But I want to take a moment and just have you think and have you be vulnerable in this moment. If you had to write your own headline about the post-pandemic impact of the well-being of your educators and students, what would it say? Take a moment and think. And if you're comfortable, put your headline in the chat so that others can see. All right. Well, according to prevalence data released in 2022 from the Centers for Disease Control, among children and adolescents aged 12 to 17, 1/5 reported having experienced at least some kind of major depressive episode. Although the pandemic did not help matters, it did not really cause what we see. This was not a new post-pandemic phenomenon. The CDC data you see on the screen is from 2009 to 2019, 10 years prior to the pandemic, which showed that high school students were demonstrating an increase in poor mental health outcomes. Now, looking more closely on the impact of the pandemic, the CDC found that more than 1/3 of high school students reported they experienced poor mental health during the pandemic, and 44% reported that they persistently felt sad or hopeless during that past year. And almost 20% had seriously considered attempting suicide. But again, this is not a new phenomenon. The pandemic just shined a light on what was already happening. And there is no doubt that we have some work to do. However, knowing what to do, where to start, and how to follow up can sometimes put districts in a state of analysis paralysis. They don't know what to do first because there's so many places to start and some seemingly insurmountable obstacles in the way. So let's break this down. Our first hurdle is really just how to take stock and approach the needs in front of us. which really is a first step in any MTSS process. The goal is to have effective universal supports to sufficiently support at least 80% of the students and provide the environment to support the success of students who require targeted or intensive support as they learn and practice new skills. So setting a universal foundation for well-being means that you've attended to the student's basic and safety and psychological needs. And we do that through universal practices that, number one, attend to the environment, creating predictable and consistent routines and procedures, establishing school-wide expectations, co-creating norms with students about how we agree to be with each other. Within a safe environment, students are more likely to learn, to engage, and to continue to develop their social and emotional skills. We also set that foundation by intentionally building relationships to foster sense of community and connectedness, as well as establish strong support networks for both kids and adults. And finally, there has to be an intentional focus on building social-emotional skills to foster those protective factors and resiliency. This typically occurs through explicit social-emotional instruction, intentional practice of skills, and generalization of skills between school and home. Focusing on these universal components helps to create a trauma-sensitive foundation of prevention and proactive response to meet the psychological needs that we all have. Resilience doesn't just come from individuals alone. It is shaped by the environments that we create. Now, traditionally, we have focused on well-being from the perspective of an absence of risk indicators. However, an absence of risk does not guarantee or equate to the presence of social-emotional skills and assets. When we focus on building skills that will foster resilience, this not only creates protective factors in students, but also positively impacts all those other best practices we use in education. It benefits students' ability to follow school-wide expectations through PBIS, to repair harm when it occurs through restorative practices, and help students be present and fully engage with instruction. Martin Seligman, the father of positive psychology, is quoted as saying, "I believe psychology has done very well in working out how to understand and treat disease. But I think that is literally half-baked. If all you do is work to fix problems to alleviate suffering, then by definition, you are working to get people to zero, to neutral." When we react to student issues that rise to the surface, this is oftentimes what we end up doing. In order to change course, we have to become more proactive in identifying what pro-social skills students are demonstrating and what skills need to be strengthened to prevent kids from relying on unproductive responses that not only get them in trouble, but can lead to poor mental health outcomes. And we need to do that through a strength-based lens. Now, while both a strength-based and a risk-based approach serve to support the mental health and well-being of students, each approach on its own is quite different. A strength-based approach focuses on building awareness of students' strengths or those protective factors, which they may have never thought about before. This gives them confidence that they have skills which will empower them to navigate through those challenging moments. It also allows us as adults to more productively partner with students and reinforce that power of yet. It allows us to get ahead of difficulties that students may be having and proactively build skills that they will absolutely need when the time comes. A risk-based approach is one that allows students to use their own voice to self-identify the feelings they're feeling, which may not always be overtly observable by others. And even though it gives us an indicator of who needs help, it is a reactive approach based on waiting for things to rise to an elevated level before we respond. So using one approach in isolation without the other can paint an incomplete picture when we're talking about comprehensive well-being. We can inadvertently miss helping students see the connection between their strengths. Here we go, sorry about that. Between their strengths and how they can use them to protect against mental health challenges. We might overlook some students who are in distress unless they are intentionally taught to self-advocate, and there are well-established supports in place for them to use. And finally, we may miss the opportunity to simply start from a place of strength, growth, and resilience. By identifying and building those social emotional assets alongside our knowledge of who is at risk, we increase our ability to effectively take action and streamline our efforts to bolster those protective factors in students so that they can use their skills in all contexts. Now, based on the research, promoting student well-being is best done through a dual model resilience and risk framework that focuses on developing strengths, or those protective factors, to promote resilience and early identification and prevention of risk factors. This framework prioritizes all the components of a trauma-sensitive approach as recommended by SAMHSA and aligns with guidance from the University of Maryland Center for School Mental Health. Students who have well-developed protective factors are better positioned to navigate challenges and to mitigate and respond to risk factors. Making sure you have a clear vision of the framework that your district will follow will serve you well as you move forward in your decision-making about next steps. But regardless of the framework that you choose, though, a comprehensive approach will include universal screening for your students so that we have a reliable and valid way to identify student strengths and have an early indicator of risk. But what do we mean by universal screening? So according to the Center for School Mental Health, universal screening is the assessment of students to determine whether they may be at risk for concerns regarding their well-being. Screening can be conducted broadly or with defined populations, such as certain grade levels. But it's broad on purpose, trying to catch as many individuals as possible who may be at risk. And screening is simply designed to identify risk factors so that we can act quickly and effectively using that reliable data. It shifts the focus from a reactive wait to fail model to a proactive system where needs are identified early and interventions are delivered efficiently. When done well, there are several benefits. First, it allows for early identification of risk, which can then inform a more systematic, proactive approach to universal and advanced tier supports and programming, following that public health model of support. Second, having that data then allows us to intentionally monitor the strengths and needs of students over time. And then finally, using universal screening proactively is considerably more cost-effective compared to a reactive approach that tends to lead to more long-term or highly intensive supports. The challenges that many districts experience that prevent them from getting started with universal screening are simply, number one, not knowing what reliable and valid measures are available. Number two, budget limitations. And then number three, limited resources and supports for following up, among other legal, logistical, and community issues that we will continue to address during today's webinar. Districts simply need guidance. And I applaud you all for taking that step to learn more today. You know, the hardest part of any new venture is making sure that we're all on the same page, we all know where we're going, and we all know when we will arrive. So that's the point of a clear vision through your district's strategic plan. However, you'll want to ensure that the vision is created collaboratively with all of your relevant stakeholders, your students, your educators, families, and relevant community partnerships, especially when we're talking about student well-being. Setting clear goals and action steps with the input from all your stakeholders creates transparency and trust. Without those two things, engaging in any initiative for well-being will be an uphill battle. Next, we should take stock of existing risk-based data that you may already have in place. Having something of an early warning system within your MTSS framework based on readily available data is a great start. This is also a great way to avoid duplication of efforts to preserve your financial resources. We oftentimes actually have plenty of data in districts that measure risk: attendance, grades, nurse visits, behavior referrals, suspensions. What many districts lack is actually step 3. a way to reliably determine whether they are in fact building students' social-emotional skills strengths or those protective factors. So starting with strengths is crucial to building partnerships with your students and your families. Strengths-based measures tend to be more palatable to families. They also minimize bias because we're asking educators and students to focus on what they are doing well. And finally, it helps us to authentically partner with students and families to increase student ownership over their learning and well-being, thus increasing student engagement. One of the barriers to engaging in screening generally is simply not knowing what is out there. So it'll be important to do your due diligence to find out what psychometrically sound screeners for student social emotional skills strengths are available. And we'll talk about some today. And lastly, our final step in this part of the process is really to close the loop on a comprehensive approach to universal screening. You may want to consider incorporating a risk-based mental health screener to ensure that you're catching all students and that no one is falling through the cracks. But this last step, that can be challenging if you haven't done the steps before. So now that I've given you some foundation on where to start to support comprehensive student well-being based on what experts in the field tell us and what others have found to be barriers, let's take a moment to see what apprehensions or wonders you might have. Take a moment and think, and just focusing on identifying where to start. And just take a moment and think. And when you're ready, put something in the chat so that we can all learn from each other. So now that you've had a little bit of time to reflect on that approach, let's take a look at some actionable next steps that you may be able to take for this piece of the puzzle. So always, always, always start with the vision, the why, and include the people doing the work and benefiting from the work. Don't tell, then sell. Actually include stakeholder voice in the process. This could look simply like holding focus groups and then communicating out what you heard back to the community. And don't forget, students are a huge part of your community and they do have a voice. We want to do things with students, not to them. Without honoring what the community values, any plans to address student well-being are likely to falter. As you gather insight about what the community values in terms of well-being and what makes sense in terms of next steps, prioritize those next steps front and center in your strategic plan to help the community see that what they value in terms of student well-being is reflected in the goals and action steps that a district has planned for their children and the data that they will use to show families that it's working. Next, make sure to take time to explore and identify psychometrically sound screening tools that will fit your needs. And do this alongside assessing the bandwidth of your student support staff, such as counselors, school psychologists, and social workers, among others. And this will go a long way to building buy-in. Most districts with some version of an MTSS framework will most likely have a team responsible for gathering, analyzing data for universal and advanced tier supports. But if not, this would also be a crucial next step. And that team should represent the expertise you have in your building. And finally, one of the biggest hurdles to engage in universal screening is the legal and ethical considerations. So you'll want to take time to review and consider federal and state law as it relates to assessment of student data generally, assessment of sensitive information specifically, and issues of parental consent, student assent, how you communicate at all points along the process, and how you ensure the confidentiality of student data. Providing good information to your families about well-being, screening, and follow-up prior to getting started will help families build their background knowledge and address their concerns. Following through on those processes will ensure that you will do what you say, and this goes a long way to building that sacred trust with your community. So I've given you some links on the screen, and again, you'll get all of these after the webinar today to really help you walk through these steps. Hearing about best practices, though, is very different than hearing from someone who is doing the work. So let's hear from someone doing the work. So let me introduce you to Cynthia Price. Cynthia is a licensed clinical social worker, board certified by the American Board of Clinical Social Work. She received a Bachelor of Social Work from Eastern New Mexico University, a Master of Social Work from New Mexico Highlands University, a Master Certification in Applied Behavior Analysis from the University of Cincinnati, and is currently completing state requirements to obtain an educational administrative license. She's a commissioned behavioral health officer in the New Mexico National Guard and has worked as a district-wide behavior specialist for Roswell Independent School District for the past 10 years, with a total of 18 years experience working with students and initiatives related to mental health, student behavior, special education. And most recently, Cynthia is focused on building multi-layered systems of support for behavior with a shift from focusing solely on special education interventions to building preventative and targeted systems of support across behavior and social emotional learning. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you.
It's so awesome to have you with us today, and I'm excited to learn about your approach in Roswell, and I'm really curious. I'm curious to know, how did you approach and what specific actions you took to be more confident in your approach?
Yes, as you saw in my bio, I have been spending a lot of time in special education and working on single case design. And what I started to see was an upward trend in special education identification and an increase for tertiary behavior supports. And we also saw an increase in district administration relying on special education staff to guide interventions for students with behavior and social emotional needs. And we quickly started to settle into fast tracking students into IDA eligibility because the mindset was that special education has the place and the practices to deal with these issues. And we realized that we needed to establish prevention and targeted interventions. And we needed to continue to see, or if we didn't, we were going to continue to see special education eligibility rise and limited resources, much like you said in your PowerPoint, to support highly intensive interventions. I started consulting with our superintendent of curriculum instruction around the need to create universal targeted supports for SEL and behavior. And we really kind of took a step-by-step approach. And hindsight, looking back, I probably would change some of these, but kind of what we did in a specific order was the first thing we did was we really studied. We really looked at the research. We understand and started to dive into MLSS and PBIS systems and understanding their similarities and knowing that the language is different but the same. We started to read guidance from the National Center of School Mental Health, as you've referenced, from the University of Maryland. We read guidance from SAMHSA as well on universal screeners and how to really how do we start? Where do we start? The second thing we did was really self-assess our current system. I used the guidance from the University of Maryland, National Center for School Mental Health. The particular article that really drove me to kind of understanding, conceptualizing the framework was titled Alignment of School Mental Health, Quality Frameworks and Tools. And it's guidance to the field. It recommends 3 self-assessment tools. You can use all of them or you can use one of them. Our district currently uses the School Mental Health Quality Assessment for the district and the PBIS Tiered Fidelity Inventory. The School Mental Health Quality Assessment allowed our district to self-assess for best practices for mental health and behavior in one system. We used a variety of providers from general education and special education to kind of score our district's quality domains, which included teaming, needs assessment. Mental health screening was one of them. Mental health promotion of Tier 1, early intervention and treatment in Tier 2 and 3. We looked at our funding sources and sustainability of those funding sources, as well as the impact it has on our student learning. And it really brought awareness to the absence of systems and whether what we were currently using in our service delivery across the tiers was in alignment to best practice. As a result of our score, which was nicely identified as emerging in all areas, this gave me and the providers confidence and the why for moving toward adopting a multiple facet of a system instead of relying on one initiative to support mental health and behavior. Additionally, the school mental health quality assessment gave me the baseline I needed to show stakeholders why we needed to adopt the DESA as our universal screener. And third, we were fortunate enough to have an elementary school whose counselor and an administrator who understood the need for universal screener and were willing to pilot the DESA for half a semester. That school completed a full semester using the DESA Mini and the DESA Full with all of their students. After that pilot, we received feedback from the school and from the counselor on how it was used at the building level. And it helped to drive the Tier 2 interventions for students and inform PLC learning for our teachers. Once we knew it could be successful in our current system, we moved to adopt the DESA screener for all schools, kindergarten through 8th grade. And in 4th grade, we included initiatives. And the 4th step we did was include initiatives into our district strategic plan. And so Aperture Education has been great in helping us identify short-term goals during this implementation year.
That's awesome, Cynthia. You have actually, I can't believe you hit on not only the approach, you hit on building buy-in with your stakeholders, and you hit on starting with a particular framework, that strengths-based approach. That is really amazing on how you really kind of broke it down kind of step by step. But it sounds like that you know, in hindsight, at some point at the end of this webinar, we're going to talk about lessons learned. So I can't wait to hear like some other things that you're going to talk about in terms of what you might do differently or how you can make improvements for moving forward. So I really appreciate hearing how you approached. So now let me give some background to sort of just getting started. And then I'm going to bring Cynthia back into the conversation to learn a little bit more so we can dig in a little bit more about that approach and how she took that step by step with her schools and with her other stakeholders. So once you've laid the foundation for this work, the next challenge is really going to be making sure that really you have all of your ducks in a row. And I can't wait to hear a little bit more about how Cynthia did this piece of this comprehensive puzzle. But you need to know exactly what you plan to do, for whom, who will lead the effort, and how you will follow up. The devil really is in the details. So one of the biggest pieces to this puzzle is figuring out who to screen. And although you eventually want to screen everyone, it may be more prudent to start small. Test processes and procedures, refine, and then scale. And that actually is a lot of what I heard from Cynthia and her experience, which is really exciting to see that alignment. A great way to focus, though, on your efforts may be, maybe you focus on transitional grades, kindergarten, 3rd, 5th, 6th, 9th. How we prepare staff for these next steps will be an important part of your success. If staff will be completing screeners, just like in Cynthia's case, they'll want to know all the ins and outs, like when, during the school day, will they screen students? How will they access resources? And what the communication plan is for families, since the teacher is typically a parent's first point of contact. What is the plan for building staff knowledge of well-being and how screening data supports that? And finally, what is the plan for analyzing data and next steps for follow-up? Who will analyze the data? How will those team members build their data literacy? How often will data be analyzed and through what structure? If we need to utilize community partnerships for follow-up, what does that referral process look like? Think a moment about all of those questions that we'll need to answer. Now, success will not be based on checking a box, but it will be based on how intentionally we plan. There are real people behind this work who need support just like our students do. Sometimes the easiest way to think about logistical planning is to reflect on past successes. So think about other initiatives that your district has implemented. What components were successful in that implementation, and why? And what got in the way? Take a moment, think. And jot down some ideas, maybe on your own, or if you feel comfortable, in the chat. So as you're thinking about those reflections, let's start to really break this down even further. So to ensure your successful planning, again, here are some next steps to consider. An effective way to implement any new initiative is to start small and scale, perhaps using a PDSA cycle to engage in rapid cycles of improvement. This will give you time to test out processes and ensure that they work well prior to implementing district-wide. I've linked in a resource from Connors et al. To show how you can use PDSA cycles to support screening and well-being in schools. I've also given you a PDSA template that you can use to support your work. You'll also want to build in purposeful time, though, to train and prepare your staff to build their confidence in the process. An effective training answers all relevant questions: the what, the why, who, when, where, and how. This will be your opportunity to paint a good picture of the system that you are building for screening and follow-up, helping staff feel confident, building their knowledge about well-being generally, and what signs of trouble looks like in students through PD, like maybe mental health first aid training. Will empower your educators and their skill sets to know how to support students. Getting their input about what the screening process will most effectively look like through those PDSA cycles will build trust and buy-in. And then to close the loop and ensure effective follow-up, well, that's going to require us to engage in some resource mapping so that you know what resources exist for follow-up at each tier of your MTSS framework. The goal, again, would be to have effective universal programming and supports in place to minimize the number of students who need support at advanced tiers. And this may take some reflection and refinement, but don't be afraid to continuously improve. The National Center for School Mental Health has some great examples, just like Cynthia talked about before, has some great examples on their site about how you might go about doing these steps. And finally, completing maybe a projection table based on known MTSS percentages. Because once you have an estimate of the number of students who may need additional support, you can then start to see how supports might have to look at advanced tiers to meet the anticipated need. This can inform entrance and exit criteria for your tier 2 groups, and when you might need to seek community partnership support. So again, now that we've talked about some theoretical best practices, let's return to our conversation with Cynthia. Welcome back, Cynthia. I'm excited to really dig in more specifically about the steps you took to really get started. But tell me a little bit more about how you scaffolded your approach to comprehensive school mental health. Like, what training did you offer? What did your MTSS data teams need to do? Tell me a little bit more about that.
So I always like to start with a visual in mind. I typically like the visual created by the National Association of School Psychologists that outlines the different layers within MLSS systems. When we put together a scaffold, and you asked me, like, how do we scaffold this? We start by putting a strong base that really holds all the layers above it. And for our district, we heavily focused on universal wellness, promotion, and prevention, and which included our social emotional learning, positive behavioral supports, school climate, and universal screening. All of those components live within that layer. And specifically, we adopted a universal SEL curriculum for pre-K through 12. That's different than the screener, but we started with classroom instruction. We developed a 5-year strategic plan to train all schools in PBIS in all tiers, layer 1, 2, or 3, or tiers, however you use it in your state. And we did so in cohorts of 5 schools at a time. We use our PBI's apps to collect climate surveys for students, staff, and parents. And we adopted the DESA as our universal screener for kindergarten through 8th grade. For DESA, Aperture Education has really trained all the counselors first. And I'm going into how we kind of trained as well. And we wanted to be sure not to overwhelm our teachers with adding something else to the mix. And so we really emphasized to our counselors how to deliver the difference between the DESA screener and the DESA curriculum to our teachers. So we had our counselors push into professional learning communities with our teachers to introduce the DESA screener to the teachers and explain how the screener would be used to determine which students needed another layer of SEL instruction and how the counselor could support additional LCL instruction in the classroom setting.
So I hear a lot about the existing structures that you used to put all this in place. Before, you talked about really starting just with a pilot and being able to scale from there. And then I heard in this conversation, you talk a little bit about PLCs. How did you use those existing structures to really, like, almost really build that trust and build build it into like how you do business almost?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we were training schools in cohorts of 5 to build PBIS systems, which is our MLSS side of behavior and SEL. And so we used our PBIS Tier 2 teams to create intervention lists for targeted supports for each building, which included, again, additional layers of SEL small groups of instruction. But how do we know which kid goes into that group? So additionally, the PBIS teams, like you mentioned, created entrance and exit criteria for each intervention that was placed on the intervention list that was offered within the building, because that could change from building to building based on the student needs within our district. And then they used the DESA to establish which students, based on that DESA score, needed Tier 2 supports and what kind of support they needed. Was it self-management? Was it self-concept? So it wasn't just this blanket approach of they need all SEL. Well, they may need a specific skill. And so that really helped us guide those particular structures in adapting our needs at what interventions were provided to students.
That's beautiful. And I hear a lot of what you're talking about. I hear a lot of using that good data to support the work. And so how did using really good data, how did that bolster your approach, and how did that make your staff feel about the decisions that they were making?
Data is important. If we don't know where we start, how do we know we made progress? And so the DESA data is helping our schools pinpoint areas of need for students and place them in correct interventions. Instead of having, again, as I mentioned before, a blanket approach to our interventions, it additionally helps us to look at mental health and behavior from 3 perspectives. I often say we have to look at it from a building level, a classroom level, and a student level. And so when we look at it, we can adapt universal interventions when we look at data from a building level. We can adapt teacher training when we look at data from a classroom level. And we can drive student-specific interventions when we look at data specifically for student. And so when we look at the DESA screener scores, we can look at it from a building level, classroom, and student, and make appropriate accommodations or changes to our delivery, to our universal curriculum, and or coaching to our teachers so that we can help support and ensure our universal interventions are done with fidelity. Additionally, if we look solely at student data for us, we indirectly continue to focus on tertiary individual interventions instead of shifting to prevention and targeted supports.
Oh, I'm not sure what just happened. Just bear with us for a moment. It looks like Lisa got knocked off. Cynthia, if you want to continue your answer, you can keep
Yeah, I
going
had
while
just
we wait.
finished with that. That's okay. Yeah, it really has been looking at knowing that data drives decisions, and we're making decisions with intention for students and for our staff as well. And so our training for our staff is based on our data. Our interventions for our students is based on data. So it really has helped guide us to be more intentional with what we're doing at the building level for supports.
Okay, that is awesome, Cynthia. And I appreciate your really thoughtfulness throughout this process. Please forgive me. I lost I lost all power in my house. Can you just confirm that you can still hear me?
Yes, Dr. McCoo, we can still hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint back up. Oh my goodness gracious. All right.
That was my fear of, being kicked off.
Yes. Give me 2 seconds to get myself back up and running here. I have never had this happen before. So please forgive me. 1 second. All right. All right, let me see if I can get this back up. I apologize.
I saw something come up in chat about if I had any recommendations on parent concerns. And so we had a lot of apprehensions when adopting even our SEL curriculum. And so right after the pandemic, we really moved to adopting an SEL curriculum at the universal layer. So it took us about 1.5 years of an SEL committee in which we got a lot of feedback from our providers in our building, as well as teaching our board and our stakeholders what is SEL. And so I think a lot of times that might be misguided or misunderstood as something else related to political agendas. And so social emotional learning has been in existence for many, many years. And so I think that when you show parents the content of social emotional learning competencies like self-management, self-concept, it really comes down to they're just soft skills that at some point in a child's life or an adult, they can put on a resume. And when you approach it from that perspective, it's an easy sell because they realize that we're not trying to change the values or belief systems in children. We're simply building skills that relate to adult success and prevent mental health in the long run. And the protective factors, as much like Dr. McCoo has talked about.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for answering that question. I wanted to see if it'd be possible if either Ash or Brandy could display the slide deck while we're talking.
Yes, let me pull it up and I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. And if you can just follow along, I know we're gonna keep going we'll get this done, I promise. Thank you so much for your patience and your flexibility. This might have been something that it's kind of a good thing that this kind of happened, and just so that we can delve in a little bit more, Cynthia. I know that we're going to talk a little bit at the end about lessons learned, but I wonder if we can go ahead and go and kind of explore that a little bit. I'm sure people are interested to find out a little bit more about, before I show an example, like really, what have you done? What lessons have you learned throughout this process? And really, where are you at now, and what's your next step?
Yeah, so we learned a lot. I mean, I think that a lot of times our apprehensions can keep us from moving forward. But I think that over time, if you just dive in and quickly understand that as long as you move in a direction of following best practices, you can chip away at apprehensions. And you can chip away with parent concerns and stakeholder concerns and address them as they come up. And I think that for us, what was most important in our lesson learned is making sure we had a district baseline before we started and moving forward, because we kind of did the baseline after maybe a year and a half of starting our universal curriculum. And so what we learned is that baseline really creates accountability to where we're moving. And again, data gives us a starting point. And I think a lot of people sometimes can be very apprehensive about giving yourself a self-assessment as a district, like, oh, it's going to show we're not doing so well. That's okay. I mean, I think that giving a baseline and knowing where we start allows us to show improvement semester, year from now, and celebrate those wins when we continually add to the comprehensive mental health system within our schools. One of the things that you can also make sure you give yourself some grace, because building these systems is not going to be perfect. Make your goal continuous improvement, but don't pivot when it gets hard. Growth happens when we move through uncomfortable situations, and those are parents being resistant, that's stakeholders not understanding SEL, behavior, and mental health. A lot of our educators don't come from that background, and so I think that it's important that we have to stay consistent with education. Make sure that your leader we have buy-in from our superintendent and your board. Those are keys to making sure you sustain things.
Yeah.
Build infrastructure. I can't say this enough. We don't really have a lot of infrastructure around behavior and mental health and SEL within our schools. And so that can if we don't build that first, we're going to have staff burnout and fatigue, and we won't ensure that we can sustain the initiatives within the comprehensive mental health system. And so and lastly, I think that one of the biggest things is complete a district inventory of all your initiatives. Know what initiatives are overlapping. Are they evidence-based, the ones that you're currently using? Are some focusing on prevention or tertiary or reactionary interventions? And a lot of times we have a lot of interventions that are focusing on reactionary and tertiary, but not prevention and targeted. And so that's a little bit of my lessons learned.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, I apologize to our audience who are out there that we're going a little bit out of order. But again, I appreciate the grace that you're giving me, just like Cynthia talked about. We need grace as we're working through this process, and also as we're learning to improve. So our last piece of this puzzle is really talking about following through. So Ash, if you can go to that next slide. So when we talk about following through, really, once we've put those systems into place, just like Cynthia was talking about, we have to find time to reflect, refine, and improve. So I've given you some questions on the screen to really think about and reflect on. When you get started, what can you then reflect on and be able to take those next steps for improvement? And we've talked a lot about best practices in general. And I know that Cynthia has talked about her experience in particular. Now I want to give you a very brief example of what this might look like using data to make efficient and effective decisions about student support. So if you go to the next slide, Ash. So as a reminder, here is our process. Okay, next slide. So let me paint a picture. So after conducting focus group conversations with relevant stakeholders, schools in our district now have a unified vision connected to our strategic goals and a clear framework for student well-being, focused first on strengths, but incorporating a resilience and risk framework. So as we go to this next picture, now that we engage in universal strength-based screening using Aperture's DESA or Devereaux Student Strengths Assessment. And maybe our high school MTSS team reviews this data, which shows that we have about 12% of students needing more support since the students are maybe not demonstrating their positive pro-social skills very often. But this is actually great news because it's lower than what we anticipated. Maybe we have additional risk-based screening data along with other early warning system data points that helps us to identify a few more students, allows us to triangulate both strength-based and risk-based data to confirm who may need support, and maybe we're still within our anticipated bandwidth. When drilling down into what support students need on the DESA, maybe we're able to determine that students had the greatest need in self-awareness and optimistic thinking, which aligned with our risk-based screener data and gave us a concrete place to start in how we supported student skill building. So we'll begin to incorporate universal strategies from our strength-based programming during advisory to support this competency while we begin to plan for student support at advanced tiers. And this was a great beginning because we were able to catch students early through our proactive screening and early warning system. Next slide, Ash. So we've identified students for follow-up, planned out needed groups based on identified areas of strength and areas for growth. Now we'll share results with families along with desired next steps for small group support based on screening results. We elicit parent consent to implement those next steps. Our student support staff maybe then meet with students, focusing on observations of students' strengths plus skills the students is not yet using very often, and then invites that student to join a small group that's forming to specifically build those skills. Student assents, but also asks if it's possible to meet with someone individually. Through the planned referral process, knowing our staffing limits, we refer the student to our outside partner, Illuma, who is able to quickly establish virtual counseling for the student. Next slide. So small groups will meet weekly, focusing on social-emotional skills to foster those protective factors using lessons from the Aperture system, which is aligned to our screening data. Next slide. 8 weeks later, maybe we do another follow-up DESA assessment since it can be used for both screening and progress monitoring to see the impact of our work. And we can see concrete growth in student skills. This is a celebration. Based on student feedback, students feel supported. They know who they can go to for support and how to access that support. Students have made connections within their small groups, expanding the support networks that they have, and maybe students are observed eating lunch together. Finally, teachers have observed that students are more readily asking for help in class, demonstrating generalization of skills. So our next steps are to prioritize our next set of skills to reinforce throughout our MTSS framework or MLSS framework, triangulate this celebratory data with other key data points, and communicate overall growth back to our community. Maybe at our next school board meeting, we can share out our growth we've seen overall in student social-emotional skills that foster resilience, alongside possibly reductions in numbers of students flagged on our risk-based screener, if we're using one, and reductions in data such as threat assessments. And we can be confident that the trust that we built with the community is being honored and we're achieving our strategic goals, helping students thrive. Now, this is just an example, but hopefully you can start picturing how this might look in your district, and maybe you're getting excited. Next slide. I've pulled some key questions again to use in reflection once you've put that plan into place. Just know, again, like Cynthia spoke about before, is that this process, including building that data literacy, it takes time and refinement. Having the available staffing to support needs for our students is a clear barrier for many districts. And for that reason, I'm excited to introduce you to one of Aperture Education's newest partners, eLuma. Next slide. So eLuma is an end-to-end student services provider that addresses intervention needs for mental health and special education across a school district's multi-tiered system of support. On the screen, you can see how eLuma supports districts at every tier. And I'm so excited that we got a chance to hear from Cynthia about those lessons learned. So we're going to skip that next slide, Ash, and we're going to go straight to our summary. So again, thank you so much for your grace and your patience today. So throughout our time today, we've taken some time to unravel the many complexities of how to approach comprehensive student well-being, where to start, getting started, following through. We've also explored some strategies, some resources that you can use to walk you through this process, and some actionable next steps at each part of the process. And finally, again, we heard from our amazing district leader, Cynthia, who is doing the work. So actually, I want to, before we go to our final reflection, I just want to bring Cynthia back and just see if she has any final thoughts about things that she learned and some next steps for their journey.
Yes, thank you, Dr. McHugh. I think that all of this information would have been great for me when we were first starting out, right? To have something like this to show us why there was a need to move in a direction of adopting a universal screener. So having somebody like you with your resources, with Aperture and eLuma that can help support a district in understanding how to build those systems is huge. I think that is such a great opportunity to have you guys. And, you know, for me, who have learned through mistakes and different ways of maybe not doing it right, but I think that is the way that any district will have to move in a direction of knowing that it won't be perfect, and having you guys to support that building of the system is essential. I think it's great.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. All right, so let's go to our final reflection. So we've talked again a lot about best practices. I've given you a little bit of time to reflect along the way, but now it's your turn for our optimistic closure. So I want you to take a moment and think. In reflecting on all that you learned today, what is your first next step? Take a moment, think. And if you feel comfortable, put something in the chat. And Ash, if you don't mind going to the next slide. I want to just thank you so much for your time today. You know, the hour goes by so fast. So trying to give a good overview of best practices while sprinkling in some action steps and really hearing from our beautiful district leader, it packs a lot in. We'd love to hear from you if you'd like to learn more. There's some information about Aperture Education and eLuma. If you'd like to reach out to me, this is my contact information. And just as a reminder, all of this information will be shared out along with the slides that you can access all of the links and resources. So thank you so much for your time today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Brandy.
Thank you guys so very much. There were a couple of questions in the chat, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow. So I was wondering if you put a question in the chat, if that was answered. And if not, we have a couple of minutes that Dr. McHugh or Cynthia could answer those for you. Okay. One question that I don't think went out to everyone: will we receive CEUs for this webinar? We won't be issuing CEUs today, but all the materials that are related to the webinar, you'll receive those in your email. So Kathy, we don't really give a certificate of attendance. We do send out the webinar materials. If you need something, if you'll reach out to Ash Walker or myself, and we'll be listed on those materials, we can, I'm certainly happy to work with Ash to get something printed up for you. You're welcome. Any other questions before we end today? Okay, well, thank you all so much for attending, and we hope to see you in a webinar soon or at an event. And as Dr. McCoo said, if you need anything, please fill in the QR code, and we're happy to reach out with any additional resources or answer any questions that you might have. Have a great rest of your day and week.